wisely. So making sure that people who receive money for data collection efforts, making sure that that money is well spent and those data get used afterward, as well as removing barriers to participating in science for people at all levels. And ICPSR really plays a role in many of these pieces. We encourage best practices for data management and documentation. I'll show you that all of our curated studies have documentation with them. We ask people to think about collecting their data with sharing in mind. And so we have some resources to help you with language for your informed consent, for example. And then also our biggest mission is sharing data with the research community. That's why we were founded. And getting people to cite data so that others can see the impact that a given research project has had. And this is our lovely building. It's probably not as cool where you are as it is here. It's about 60 degrees and rainy. So it looks pretty much like the front of this building. Anyway, from here, we take an active role in fulfilling those parts of open science. So we provide options for sharing both raw data and any replication data or code. So often a journal editor, for example, will ask people to share their data and or their code before an article gets published. We've got a repository specifically for that kind of thing. We are and have been since the 1960s, thinking about democratizing access to data. So trying to make it easier for people to use the data that's driving science today. I mentioned that we do create documentation to support responsible secondary data use. So we try to give people as much of the context around the original data collection effort as we can get. We also supply data citations. So I mentioned that we encourage people to cite data. We try to make it easier for them to do that by giving them the citation in a number of different places. And we also provide persistent identifiers or DOIs for people who deposit their data so that they can show that their data have been shared. And then we have metrics that data depositors can also look at to say, hey, look, 6,000 people are using my data, or whatever that number might be. And because we're an archive, we have the goal of making sure that the data are accessible both now and into the future. So as you might imagine, in 1962, data looked much different than it does today, and the format that we used to handle data. So punch cards were a thing. I think we still have a punch card reader somewhere in this building. But since then, we've migrated through, the big reel-to-reel tapes, and then floppy disks, and for a brief moment, CDs. And now everything is downloadable, basically on demand at your desktop, public use data, that is. But as the technology changes, we evolve, and we've always got a file format that allows us to be able to do that. We link publications to the underlying data, trying to make those connections even more clear for other researchers. And we train researchers to use both complex data and the more straightforward data. I mentioned the summer program in Quantitative Methods of Social Research. That was begun in the summer of 1963. So right after we started as an archive, those individuals realized that sometimes you need some additional help in working with the data. So they wanted to make sure that that support was there as well. In terms of thinking about ICPSR's resources across the research lifecycle, we can help in the very early stages of conceptualizing your research project. If you're thinking about applying to one of the federal agencies, for example, for a grant, or even foundations, you can use our bibliography of data-related publications to see where there might be a gap, where something hasn't been studied well enough, or where the data don't quite exist to answer a research question. We also help with creating data management plans. Oh, sorry. I mentioned I forgot I had an animation in here. I mentioned the bibliography of data-related publications. Most people think that that just means journal articles. We actually have librarians on staff who look at anything from presentations, conference presentations, to doctoral dissertations, to books and book sections, anything like that that they find that have used our data in the research project, they will pull into the bibliography and link to those data. And I can show you what that looks like in a couple slides. The data management plan is a key part of many grant proposals these days. And we offer templates for helping with creating that, particularly for researchers who are using, who are applying for NIH funding and needing to put their data into an NIH approved archive. We've got language in a template that you can take and use. And we even have it helpfully highlighted in yellow and then remind you to take out the yellow. So just ways of helping you prepare that application so that you're sure you're handling data in an open and responsible way once they're collected. As you're thinking about collecting data, we have, I mentioned, some example language for informed consent so that you can share the data afterward. We don't like to see informed consent anymore that says only the research team will have access to these data. Obviously, that doesn't make for very good open science. Even data that have sensitive information or qualitative interviews, things like that, those data can be shared if done responsibly. We also have what we call the Social Sciences Variables Data Bank. I mentioned that many of our studies are marked up at the variable level. That standardized marking allows us to create what you might think of as a question bank. So here's a screenshot. I just did a search on climate change, and it brings up all of the questions that are in our data about climate change. And this is just obviously a selection of them. You can look through that list and find some that appear to be interesting to you and then compare them. So the second screenshot, I know it's a little bit hard to see, but shows the way questions about concern about climate change have been asked in a couple different surveys. It gives you the question text, it gives you the response options and the frequency distributions, and then a link back to the study itself. So that you can, if you find a question that looks good, that you might want to replicate in your own work, you can jump back to the original data collection from which it came and see what other questions may be around it in the questionnaire that might be useful for your own work as well. Once you've got data collected, we have a guide to social science data preparation and archiving, which is really a good kind of manual. It's great for graduate students working on their first big data project, things like that. It talks not only about what to keep as you're thinking about all of the decisions that you make in the data collection process, what to document, how to document it, but also sort of the practical things. How do you structure your file? How should you name your variables? It includes information about a data management plan. So if you're, again, if you're thinking in that direction, and these are really just good practices, whether you're thinking about depositing data with ICPSR or anywhere else, or even just sharing with your own research team. We like to say the first person that you curate data for is yourself. I don't know about you, but when I was working on my dissertation, for example, I thought that I would never forget the names of the variables and what they meant. A year later, I looked at it and I was like, I really am not sure. Is V105 this or this? So having that documentation right from the beginning is helpful, even if it's just you using your own data. And again, these screenshots all come from our website. The arrows point to the tabs on our homepage where you can find the information. So the guide is on the share data page. Let me take a moment and ask if there are any questions to this point. I didn't say at the beginning, but I'm happy to take questions throughout or save them to the end, whichever is best for you guys. Great, thank you. I also lost my my pictures of you. You're buried under one of my screens, so I can't actually see you. So if you do have a question, just shout at me. The sort of the bread and butter of what ICPSR does is make secondary data available to the broader public. And so sometimes it's helpful to think about what kinds of things you should come to ICPSR to find and what maybe you might want to go somewhere else. You can think of ICPSR sort of as a library for data rather than for books. So I mentioned that we are social and behavioral sciences pretty broadly defined. We started as political science. So in the early 60s, we were ICPR. They added the S for social somewhere in the, I think, mid 70s. We've expanded to behavioral science, but we decided probably it was best not to keep adding letters to our already unpronounceable acronym. So now we just kind of talk about ourselves as social and behavioral sciences, super broadly defined. We've got data about individuals, as you might imagine. That's sort of the core of what we do. And those individuals may be anything from newborns. We've got data about mother-child relationships and childcare and early childhood. We've got data about the aging population. So we cover the whole lifespan. We even actually have data about prenatal care and attitudes about euthanasia and living wills and things like that. So you might even say we go a little bit beyond birth to death. We have data about institutions, so hospitals, schools, colleges, childcare centers, police departments, things like that. We even have data about animals. That's not the most of what we have, but we have, if you're interested in the height of horses in the Habsburg Empire, I've got a link to the data set that has that in the slides. Our data are primarily from about the mid 1800s on, most of it from obviously 1960 forward, though we do have quite a bit of historical, but we do have some older data than that. The data that we have that covers the oldest time period looks at public executions in 1194 to 1294, so it's pretty old. And we know that people from many disciplines come to ICPSR to find data for their projects. When you create My Data Login, which is sort of our shopping cart, we ask you what discipline you're affiliated with. And looking at those, we know that we've got over 50 different disciplines represented in our user base. We have primarily survey and other raw data types, administrative data, structured diary data, things like that. And we do have both public and restricted use data. So some of that sensitive, confidential data, we have that as well. This slide is just to give you an idea of the breadth of the things that we have. So these are the most commonly downloaded data from our fiscal year runs July 1st to June 30th. So I did this for July 1st, 2022 to June 30th, 2023. And the thing I love about this list is that it changes depending on what's going on in the world at the time. So ad health will always be our top most commonly downloaded study. There is just so much in it and so much you can do with it. In fact, the ad health study has 42 data sets, I believe. So lots of different informants, lots of different waves of data, contextual data, things like that. So it will always be at the top. The India Human Development Survey is always right up there as well. But then the ones underneath that kind of change a little bit. If you think about what the world looked like in 2020, our list of popular data had a lot more data sets that dealt with policing and community relations than you might see this year. This year is the first time that we've got 2 transgender surveys showing up in the most popular data. So just a variety of different kinds of things that people are using for their own research. Just like knowing what you could find is helpful, I think knowing what you won't find is also helpful. So you won't find answers to questions that you might ask Google. So if you ask Google, how many people in the United States speak more than one language? Google will give you an answer. If you ask our search engine that, you'll get a list of studies that will may or may not have the questions that will help you answer those data, but you'll have to do the analysis to find it. In that same vein, we don't have a lot of summary charts or tables of data. We've got the underlying data. We do have some summary charts. I direct the National Archive of Data on Arts and Culture, and they do often put state level descriptions of artists, for example, things like that. So they will put some summary data, but that is by far the exception, not the rule. You won't find identifiable information about individuals or organizations. A big piece of responsible science is making sure that respondents are protected. And so all of our data go through a disclosure risk review before they're made available. And we take out anything that is either a direct or an indirect identifier. If we can't sort of take them out or lessen the level of detail, we'll make the data restricted. So, but even in restricted data, you won't find individuals' names or full birth dates, things like that. You won't find pure genetics data or natural sciences data. There has to be some human component to the data. For the same reason that you won't find identifiable information about individuals or organizations, we're not the best place to look for data to use in GIS or other mapping packages. We often take out that fine level geography information if it's in the data to begin with. For example, federal surveys require the smallest geographic unit to be census region. So Northeast, South, Midwest, that kind of thing, not even state level location information. We are incorporating new data types all the time. So we do have images. You might have noticed on the list of popular data, we've got a study about brain lesions after strokes. We have brain scan images in there. We also have a file with autopsy images. So we do have some image data. We've got other kinds of qualitative data like unstructured interviews or the presidential inaugural addresses, for example. But that's not the That's not the core of what you'll find. So if you know that you're looking from the start for qualitative data, you might want to look in the qualitative data repository out of Syracuse or someplace else besides ICPSR. We just launched this January a social media data archive. So that is one area that we are expanding in, and you can look to see more in that realm later. We have about 20 studies in that repository already. In thinking about what makes ICPSR unique from other places that you can get data, I mentioned that we have a long history, and one of our explicit goals is preservation, making those data available over time. Some of the other places that you can share data don't necessarily think about preservation, or that's not one of their top goals. So a website that might be there today may or may not be there tomorrow. We do have broad disciplinary coverage. There are other archives like one of my favorites is the Association of Religion Data Archives, the ARDA. They have a much narrower scope in terms of what data you can find there. So for their archive, for something to be included, it has to include a question or two about religion. We don't have that kind of sort of limitation on our acquisitions policy. We also have pointers to data that are held elsewhere. So even if ICPSR isn't the place that holds the data, we still try to help you find it wherever possible. We have both curated studies, which means we do some work to the data before we put them out, and we have self-published studies. So if you're just looking to share your data quickly and get a DOI to report to your funder, we have a way to do that as well. And I'll show you what those both look like as we go. Our curated data is documented as well as we can make it. I mentioned that there is information about both the study and the variables in many cases. All of our data are formatted for the common statistical packages. So R, SPSS data, SAS, and some of them, about 1,400 of the 19,000 have online analysis capabilities as well. So you don't even need to download the data to be able to do the same kind of analyses you would do in SPSS, for example. And I mentioned that we give a recommended data citation and the bibliography of data-related literature. That's something that most other archives don't have. We try to make it easy to find what you need. 19,000 studies is a lot to wade through, but we've got a couple different search strategies. So before I go into those, any questions about this part? Great. I hope that doesn't mean everybody's asleep. If you want, if you have a laptop in front of you and you want to play along, you can find us at icpsr.org or icpsr.umich.edu, which is just a little bit longer. And when you get there, you'll see our lovely new homepage, which I had on the opening slide. But we'll be spending most of our time on this Find Data tab, which is the second tab over. And this is what that screenshot looks like. From almost every ICPSR page, you'll find a search bar at the top. On the Find Data page, there's also a search bar lower down in the page. You can also browse the different sort of ways of slicing and dicing the collection. And then we have the different search tools like the social science variables database is that search and compare variables, and the data related publications are in that Find Data tab. And I'll talk about thematic data collections in a minute. But whatever you type into the search bar, it will actually search everything. So this is just a screenshot of a basic search. And the results returned, I searched on youth mental health, just as an example. And each of the, anytime you search anything like that, you'll get this sort of tabbed display. There's filters on the left-hand side, and the filters change depending on which tab you're on. And then there are tabs across the top for the first one that shows is the studies that reflect that keyword. The variables are next. The data related publications are also there. And then anytime the words appear on the ICPSR website, that one is probably not as useful, especially as most people are searching for data and not necessarily other information. But you might search, I'll show you at the very end, we have a new scholarship competition. You might search for that and just typing it in the search bar, and then look at the ICPSR website results, and it should be there. When you get search results for studies, you can filter them. I mentioned on the left-hand side, some of the most useful filters to think about are restriction type, which will give you, allow you to choose data that have at least some public use data. That's especially helpful if you're working with students and they have a project that's due within a semester. Restricted access data is available to them, but sometimes it takes a little while to get. And you also have to go through the university to get signatures and things like that. So you can restrict it to publicly available data. You can also use the data format facet to choose your statistical package. So if you want to make sure that the data are in R, for example, you can limit it to the data sets that have the R format. You can also sort your search in a couple different ways. So relevance is the default, but you can look for the data that are about the most recent time period, and that would be sorting by time period. Recent releases will give you anything that we've put out most recently, which generally overlaps pretty well with the time period. But if somebody gives us data that were collected or are about an event in 1840, for example, and we put that out yesterday, that will show up at the top of recent releases. If you want only curated studies, so the studies that have the standardized sort of format, the different data file types, the documentation, you can limit your search by including the -open ICPSR. And that'll take out those self-published studies. And then I also have this arrow in the middle. It's a toggle for allowing you to see the description of the study right within that search results page. Some of them are pretty long. Some of them might be a screen or two to scroll down. So we hide them by default, but you can toggle that on and see the summaries of the different studies without even jumping out to the study home pages. I mentioned that it searches everything. These slides just show you that. So that was the study. This one is the variables. So this is any of anytime the words youth mental health show up in the question text, the variable label, the value label, or the variable name, it will be included in this list, and that's that gives you results that come from that social science variables database. So they're going to look like the screenshot earlier. The data related publications, again, fourth tab over in this display, but it will show you anytime your keywords show up in the title or the abstract, if we have it, of the publications in our bibliography. So if you know that you only want particular variables, if your key concepts are defined in a very specific way, start with the search and compare variables. You don't need to start with that full study search. You can start also with the data-related publications. When you find a publication that looks interesting, if it's available in full text, if it's a PDF, we link to that. If it's available through one of the journal subscriptions or the aggregation services, we will link to it, and it uses a link resolver behind the scenes so that anything that your university has access to, you can see the full text right from the ICPSR page. You don't even have to jump out to the library to try to find the publication. And every data-related publication links back to the data that are used within that publication. We also have our data grouped in thematic data collections, and these are often funded by government entities or foundations. And if you have a broad interest in a topic area, but aren't really quite sure what you want to do as a research project, this would be a good place to start. And if you click the thematic data collections on that Find Data tab, you'll get this page. And from there, you can click the data collections button, and that will take you to a list of the different data collections that we have. The thematic data collections. I've got them listed here kind of by broad topical area, and again, all of them are linked. So if you get a copy of these slides, you don't even need to search for them. You can just jump right out from the slide. But we have a number of different thematic collections or topical archives, whatever you want to call it. The thing to remember, if you do a search on one of these thematic collection pages, so this is the homepage of our demography archive. If you do a search from that page, it will only search the studies that sort of belong to that topical collection. So if you don't see as many search results as you might expect, pull back and jump out to the ICPSR page and try your search again. A lot of times the funders have very specific guidelines about what goes into the thematic data collections. I mentioned that I direct the Arts and Culture Archive. We work with the National Endowment for the Arts, and they actually give us a list of what 4 or 5 studies they want curated every year. So they have complete control of what goes in. And we may have, in fact, we do have data that are related to arts and culture that aren't in the Arts and Culture Archive. So sometimes it's a great place to start if you're just kind of getting your bearings and looking for what's out there. But if you're doing a search and you don't find what you need, pull back and do it on the main ICPSR page. You might have better luck that way. All of our studies have standardized descriptions. All of our curated studies have standardized descriptions. So you'll always get a page that describes the data collection effort. There's methodological information further down on this tab. So who was in the sample, who was the universe, how were the data collected, when were the data collected, things like that. All that information is there. We also give you, for most of our studies, a list of the variables that are in that study. It's searchable, so you can sort it by particular data set. If you're only, this example is from AdHealth, which I mentioned has 42 data sets. If you know that you only want the first wave of data and you want to look at data set 1, you can sort by the data set order. And then you'll only look at those, the variables that are in that first data set. We also have the publications that are tied to those data linked right to that study homepage. So again, this is also a way, if you find a study that looks interesting but isn't quite what you want, the data-related publications show you maybe that some of the articles used AdHealth, but they also use something else with it. You might click that link and see what that other study is. or there are subject terms at the bottom of the at a glance tab, and you can click on one of those and see what other studies have been tagged with those study terms. So again, trying to make it easy to evaluate the data you find, but also you can use these pages to find other data if it's not quite what you want. Once you find data that look promising, you can download them either by downloading all of the files at once or by going just the specific files that you want. Either by using the tab in the middle, that'll give you all of the files, or the data and documentation tab where you can select each one. With whichever way you do it, you get to select the file format that you want. And in your download, you'll get not only the data, but the codebook that we've created. If the principal investigator or data provider gives us a codebook, you'll get that. If we have a questionnaire or interview guide, we'll give you that. You'll get the citation. I mentioned that we recommend people use it. So it's on the study homepage under Cite This Study. It's also on that first at a glance tab, and we give it to you in your download as a separate file as well as in the codebook. So we try to make it easy for people to use that. And then you'll get a copy of the study homepage itself. So you'll have all that information that our curators have put together about the data, which is helpful when you're writing your methods section. And then when you click to download data, you will have to agree to terms of use, and you'll get a copy of those terms of use in your download as well. We know that everybody reads them super carefully, except not. But the main ideas in the terms of use are that you won't redistribute the data, you won't use them for commercial purposes, and you won't try to identify any individual within the data. You'll use them for research purposes. Some of our data are restricted, either because they're about sensitive topics, or there's some detail that might lead to potentially identifying some respondents or increased disclosure risk. Those data can be applied for right on the study homepage. The red bar across the side will let you know that there are restricted files, and then you can click the button in the middle, and when you do that, it'll pop up the modal to start the application. An application for restricted use data typically requires a faculty member to be the PI or the lead researcher. That's not because we don't trust students or because students can't have data. It's just that all of the restricted use agreements have things like time limits. What happens when your project is done, or sort of what are the limits in which you can use the data. And faculty members are a little bit easier to track down to say, hey, it's 2 years after you got the data, have you destroyed them? Or do you need an extension? Things like that. The last piece of the data life cycle, so if you're collecting your own data, is sharing those data so that other people can do the secondary analysis that we were just talking about. And we have a couple different options for that. So currently it's 2 separate streams. You can deposit data for the curated collection or in our self-publishing archive. Both are free. Both make the data available to the broader research community. The curated collection, if you deposit data and don't have any funding, for example, from your grant to pay for curation, those data will be available to individuals at member institutions. And ICPSR has, I believe last count was 825 member institutions around the world. So that is not as restrictive as it might sound. Florida State is a member. Most of the research intensive universities are members. Lots of the research intensive, and also master's and bachelor's level institutions, people in research organizations outside of academia are members of ICPSR. So they would be able to get access to those data for free. Anybody who's not at a member institution can also pay to access those data if you deposit them and they're curated with member funds. I mentioned that when we do the curated collection, we do that disclosure risk review, we create the metadata, that standardized information, we create that preservation format. We also do user support on the back end. So once the data are out, it does take a while to get data curated, depending on the complexity of the data and kind of where it is in the queue. It might take a couple months or more. If you want an immediate way to share your data and to show that you have shared it, you can deposit it in the self-publishing archive, Open ICPSR. And there, whatever you deposit is what users get. We don't do any review of it. We don't add any kind of documentation or file formats or anything like that. That's a great place to put replication data. If you're publishing a manuscript and the editor asks that you share your data, Open ICPSR is a recognized repository for that. Either way that you deposit, we give you the ability to show impact of your data. We provide that data citation and the persistent identifier, and either one is included in the ICPSR search results. So people will be able to find it no matter which way it is published. This is just an example of one of the journal repositories. The American Economic Association requires people publishing in any of their journals to deposit with Open ICPSR. We have resources to help with that deposit. We've got specific resources based on the new NIH guidelines and some other information for qualitative data. I'm moving quickly because I know that we are just about out of time. Showing impact, we do show the number of downloads and the number of data-related publications for each study. We break that down even further into the number of users and what they've downloaded, whether it's the data and documentation or the documentation only, which of the data sets are most popular. And then we give you a sense of sort of who's using the data, whether they're graduate students, faculty, other researchers. The guest users is because you don't have to be logged in to download documentation. So we don't always know who those people are. For some disciplines, pre-registering data or pre-registering a research project allows people to sort of lay claim to their idea and helps with the propensity to publish only significant results. Sometimes journals will allow you to pre-register your idea with a promise to publish, things like that. ICPSR has a pre-registry for education-related studies, studies of efficacy and effectiveness. So that's just another way of thinking about open science. We have teaching and learning resources. I mentioned the summer program. This gives you the information about the program. All of the courses are now hybrid, so you can either take them on site in Ann Arbor or wherever they're offered, or online. There are scholarships. They're 3-week courses and shorter 1 to 5 day workshops. This is just some examples of ones that were offered this year. We have resources for use in the undergraduate classroom, resources specifically aimed at students. So interpreting data output, reading a journal article, things like that. We've got the new data communication scholarship. So we're asking bachelor's or master's students to find a study in the ICPSR catalog and do essentially a 2-minute commercial about it. So there's more information. Again, the screenshot is linked to the details about the competition. And if you're interested in anything from ICPSR, you can sign up for our email announcements. We've got a YouTube channel where all of our public webinars are recorded and kept. We've got short videos, the ICPSR 101 series. We just released My Professor Said series, subtitled "There Are No Stupid Questions About Data." We've got a podcast, and we're on the usual social media suspects. And so I've given you ways to connect with us there. And I think just at the end of time, I have time for questions, and also my direct contact information if you have further questions, and the overall ICPSR help information. So if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to take that.
Sure.
Take
so if there are any questions in the room, just raise your hand. I'll bring you the mic.
And I'm going to stop sharing so I can see your faces again. Or at
Hi,
least see Jonathan's
Lynette.
face.
Thanks for your presentation. I have a couple of questions about the data curation process. So how many data curators are there at ICPSR?
That is a great question. I believe we are currently between 40 and 50. Somewhere, if I had to guess, I would say somewhere around 45.
I see. And how are projects, I guess, prioritized for curation? It's by request, and then a choice has to be made, or who's making that decision?
Another great question. So for the thematic data collections or the topical archives, the funders help make that decision, and often priority is based on whatever order the studies come in, or if the funder wants a particular one to get out quicker, they will help with that prioritization. For the ones that come in for the members archive, we just, as in 2 days ago, started a new structure where they will come in, and there are now topical archives within that sort of membership group. And I direct the social sciences one. So we will be able to look through those, and if there's funding for curation, sometimes that moves it up to the top of the list. Otherwise, we look at things that are most highly valued. So things that might be longitudinal or national random samples, things like that. And we prioritize those. But we do also have different levels of curation. So we can put some of them out faster. We have what we call a fast release, where we essentially zip up what the depositor gave us, create a metadata record for it, and put that out. So we don't have as long of a backlog as we might have had even a year ago. So it doesn't take as long to get curation started on the data deposits as it did before.
And really quickly, just a more fundamental question. Are the data curators full-time paid positions, or how does that work?
Okay. They are, and I should have left a slide in. I usually include a slide saying, think about ICPSR as a job opportunity. Particularly, so many of our curators are individuals who have a bachelor's degree in a social science or behavioral science discipline. Some of them have masters and PhDs, but they are full-time paid positions. And there's a hierarchy within curators, so you can move up. You start as a general curator. There are curation supervisors, senior curators, things like that. We also have project management staff that interface with both with the funders, the project directors, and the curators. And those are often people with backgrounds in social sciences that may or may not have graduate degrees.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. There's a formal training process for our curators as well. So we don't expect people to know stuff coming in.
Yeah, hi, Lynette. This is Mark Riley. I'm a physics professor here at FSU. And, you know, open science to me sounds a bit like a tautology. I mean, science is supposed to be open, but thank you for all that you're doing. It's just phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. So I have a question. I mean, to me, open science has got to grow and become more and more prevalent everywhere. We've got to keep the mission moving forward. So for you, have you projects that you'd love to implement if you had the resources? So where would you like to be in 5 years? Or if your budget was doubled tomorrow, what would you do?
Wow. That is not the question I was expecting. Those are excellent questions. I think a couple of things come to mind, and I might have a different answer if I had a little while to think about it, but couple things that come to mind. One is working with some of the funding agencies who are funding some of the big data collection efforts. They have guidelines that data need to be shared, but they don't have a lot of sort of teeth to those. So they're starting to, if you don't share your data and you said you would, they're starting to use that in evaluating whether you get additional funding. But it would be great if those, the National Science Foundation, NIH, for example, could help fund some of the curation activities of places like ICPSR. And obviously there are repositories in physics and all kinds of different disciplines who are doing the work to make data available. That would allow us to sort of scale up what we do. I think also making it easier for making data sharing, and all my open science comes through data sharing just because that's where I am. I think somehow making that part of training from, you know, even thinking about it as an undergrad. There's a great project out of, Haverford College, called Teaching, it's Project Tier, Teaching, oh, I'm blanking on it. But basically, it teaches students how to document their data and how to structure their data files, how to write their code, how to comment it, so that they, and it started because the professor couldn't replicate students' results when they were asking why things didn't work. He couldn't get them to not work in the same way that the students were having trouble. And so he realized that he needed to see exactly what data they were starting with, what their code was. And so they teach that as part of data analysis and data management. And if we started that from the very beginning of teaching people to think about research, we wouldn't think of it as a burden. We wouldn't think of data sharing and reproducibility as something that is an add-on and an afterthought, but would be something that's part of the process and just sort of the day-to-day life of research. And I think that we need to have some of those bigger sort of efforts to really get the open science piece to break through some of the old kind of mindsets of, but I collected these data, I spent a long time on it, It's my project. I don't want you to scoop my results. All of that kind of thing. Some of that kind of thinking needs to change, and it's hard to change in small ways. So if we could have some bigger efforts to help change that, I think that's where I would go.
Fantastic, Lynette. Thanks so much. I'm very optimistic for the future because, you know, we're part of the Helios initiative, and you are too, and you know the OSTP. I'm looking forward to when there's more resources put in to what you're doing and what we're all trying to achieve, because open science and open is the future. Thank you.
Agreed. And I think physics is leading the way in some regards.
All right, unfortunately, I think we're out of time. Dr. Holter, thank you again for joining us this morning. Can we give her one more
Sure.
round of applause for her presentation?
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. All right, everyone. So we will be we're moving on to room 101 next door for the I Have a Problem session. If you have a problem that you would like to brainstorm with